He doesn't deal well with numbers, my wife said. She said it the way you might describe the weather in a place you've never been, confidently, without needing evidence. He never has. Since his mother passed, he's been completely lost. The mediator, a woman named Judith Quine, sat at the head of a narrow conference table in a building on the edge of downtown Columbus that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. She was in her mid-60s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, a yellow notepad in front of her that she'd been writing on steadily until just a moment ago when she stopped. Lost, she repeated, not as a question, more like she was testing the word for weight. My wife's attorney, a compact man named Mercer Lowe who wore his suit like it was a performance, shifted once in his chair. What my client is describing, he said, is a period of diminished capacity following the loss of a parent. Nothing clinical, but documented in the correspondence she submitted. Judith Quine looked at the correspondence, then she looked at me. I set my hands flat on the table and said nothing. I had learned over a long career that the best thing you can do when someone is building a case against you is let them build it. People who believe they are winning stop watching their flanks. My name is Wallace Greer. I'm 61 years old. I spent 31 years as a senior fraud examiner for a regional insurance carrier. Then, 4 more in independent consulting for firms that needed someone to look at property transactions the way a pathologist looks at tissue, carefully, without the pressure to find what the referring physician expected. I testified in 64 civil and federal proceedings. I have been retained by 4 different state attorneys general. I am not, as my wife's attorney had just implied, a man who pushes paper. She knew this. She had known it for 26 years, at some point knowing it had become inconvenient. 7 weeks earlier, my wife had arranged a mediation session concerning my mother's estate. My sister, who lived in Savannah, was joining by phone. The mediation concerned my mother's property, a house in Circleville, Ohio, and a small investment account she had tended carefully for 40 years. My wife had been managing the correspondence with the estate attorney since my mother's death 9 months prior. She had framed that arrangement as a kindness. I had accepted it as one. The mediation was supposed to be procedural. That was how it had been described to me. Sign a few things, confirm the distribution, finalize the sale. The sale. That word mattered. My mother had lived in that house for 38 years. She'd bought it with my father, raised 3 children in it, and stayed after my father died because she said the rooms still held him. She had been clear about one thing in the last few years of her life. She wanted the house sold to someone who would use it, not a developer, not a holding company, a family, if possible. The offer my wife had arranged, through my brother-in-law, who was a licensed real estate agent, was from something called Meridian Valley Properties, LLC. The offer was $187,000. The county assessor had the property at $261,000. Comparable sales in the past 18 months averaged $248,000. My wife, when I mentioned this discrepancy one evening in March, said the market was softening and that my brother-in-law knew the area better than either of us, and that I was letting sentimentality interfere with a straightforward decision. I had nodded, or appeared to. I drove to Circleville the following Saturday. My mother's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Vera Stills, had been collecting the mail and keeping an eye on the property. She met me on the porch with a mason jar of iced tea and the kind of careful expression people make when they have something to say and aren't sure they should. Your brother-in-law was here, she said, 3 weeks back. Brought someone with him. They walked the property for about 40 minutes. I asked her to describe the person. She described a woman in a gray blazer who had taken photographs and written things in a small notebook. I thanked Vera and went inside. My mother had been organized in the way that people who grew up with very little tend to be organized, everything documented, everything filed, nothing assumed. The desk in the back bedroom had 3 drawers. The bottom drawer held a fireproof box I had known about since I was a teenager. My mother had shown it to me after my father's funeral, the same way she showed me where she kept the spare key and where the insurance policies were. She was practical about those things. She didn't treat death as a subject to avoid. The key was on a hook inside the linen closet, behind a stack of guest towels she'd had since 1987. Inside the box were the expected documents: the deed, her will, the investment account records, my parents' marriage certificate. But at the bottom, in an envelope sealed with a strip of tape and labeled in her handwriting with the word Wallace, was a folded sheet of paper. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held it for a moment before I opened it. My mother's handwriting had always been the same, small, precise, every letter fully formed, the kind of script that belonged to a generation taught penmanship as a matter of character. The letter was dated 5 months before she died, which meant she had written it during a period when she was still entirely herself, still sharp, still making her own appointments and balancing her own checkbook. She wrote that my brother-in-law had come to see her in June, alone, and had presented her with paperwork about the house. He described it as preliminary. She had not signed anything. She wrote that he mentioned Meridian Valley Properties by name and described it as a reputable buyer with community ties. She had asked him to leave the paperwork and said she would have someone look at it. She never mentioned it to me at the time. She wrote that she didn't want to make trouble in my marriage over something that might be nothing. But she also wrote that she had looked at the paperwork herself and that the name on the Meridian Valley Properties filing didn't match what her son-in-law had described as community-focused ownership. She wrote the name she had found, his name, listed as one of 2 managing members of the LLC. Her last paragraph was short. You have always known how to look at things without letting your feelings about them get in the way. That is not a small thing. Don't let anyone tell you that being careful is the same as being slow. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to move across the floor the way it used to when I was a child doing homework in that same room. When I left, I took photographs of everything. The originals stayed exactly where she had put them. That afternoon, I called a woman named Irene Caldwell. I had worked alongside Irene 15 years earlier when she was associate counsel for the state insurance department, and I was consulting on a property flip scheme that had defrauded 11 families in Franklin County. She was now in private practice in Columbus. She was the kind of attorney who asks one question and then listens without interrupting until you've said everything worth saying. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, they've made an assumption. What kind? I asked. That grief makes people tractable. They expected you to sign and not look. She explained what a proper challenge looked like. She explained what the LLC filings would show if someone requested them through the right channels. She explained what the State Real Estate Licensing Board took seriously when a licensed agent failed to disclose a personal financial interest in a transaction involving a family member. She said the word undisclosed 3 times, and each time it landed differently. What do you want to walk away with? She asked. I want the transaction voided. I want my sister to receive what my mother intended her to have, and I want it done quietly enough that the mechanism matters more than the confrontation. Then we document and let the mediation do the work, she said. Can you stay inside their expectations for a few weeks? I told her I had been doing that for most of my marriage. For the next 4 weeks, I lived carefully within the shape my wife had built for me. I answered her questions briefly. I let her believe I was grieving and preoccupied and content to let her handle the details. When she showed me papers, I read them at the table and made small sounds of acknowledgement and signed what was appropriate to sign and asked nothing about the rest. I watched her shoulders ease over those weeks. I recognized the ease. It had a specific quality, the quality of someone who has calculated the risk and decided it is past. Irene worked through proper channels. She requested the LLC operating agreement from the Ohio Secretary of State's office. She contacted the State Real Estate Licensing Board. She located an independent appraiser, no prior relationship to any party, who assessed the property and put fair market value in writing at $251,000. She also found that Meridian Valley Properties had made 6 prior purchases of residential property in Central Ohio, all at significant discounts from assessed value, all resold within 14 months at considerable profit. The woman in the gray blazer, it turned out, was a project manager for a development firm that had been working with Meridian Valley Properties on 3 of those 6 transactions. She was not, in any meaningful sense, a community buyer. The night before the mediation, I drove to Circleville and sat in the driveway of my mother's house. Vera Stills had been keeping the porch light on. I sat in the car and watched it and thought about my mother writing that letter, folding it carefully, sealing it, labeling it with my name. She hadn't been angry when she wrote it. The tone was too measured for anger. She had been careful. She had prepared, the way she always prepared for things she couldn't control, quietly and ahead of time, so that someone who came looking would find what they needed. In the conference room the following morning, when Mercer Lowe presented the timeline, the reasonable offer, my mother's stated wish to have the estate settled without dispute, my own apparent disengagement from the process, I stayed still. When my wife described my condition as lost, I looked at the table. When Judith Quine paused and asked about my professional background, I let my wife answer first. He worked in insurance, my wife said. Claims. He's been retired for 2 years. He hasn't been engaged with any of this. Judith Quine tilted her head a fraction. What area of insurance? My wife glanced at Mercer Lowe. Property, general property. He reviewed paperwork. The mediator looked at me. Would you like to describe your work yourself? I stood. 31 years as a senior fraud examiner, I said. I reviewed property claims flagged for irregular valuation, undisclosed ownership, and misrepresented condition. In the last 12 years of my career, I specialized in identifying instances where a licensed agent held a financial interest in a transaction they were facilitating for a client or family member without disclosure. I have testified in 64 proceedings. 3 resulted in felony convictions. I have been retained as an expert by 4 state attorneys general. I am currently consulting on 2 active matters. The room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Judith Quine looked at Mercer Lowe. "Counselor," she said, "were you aware of your opposing party's professional background?" Mercer Lowe said something about understanding that my background was in the insurance industry. "In the insurance industry," she repeated, with a precision that wasn't quite an echo. My wife uncrossed her arms and then crossed them again. I recognized the expression on her face. Not guilt, not shame exactly, but the particular look of someone who has just realized the room is arranged differently than they expected and is recalculating in real time. Irene rose without urgency. She placed one document in front of the Mediator. "The LLC operating agreement for Meridian Valley Properties," she said. "I'd like to direct your attention to the list of managing members on page 3. Judith Quine read it. My brother-in-law's name was on page 3. Mercer Lowe objected to something. Judith raised one hand without looking at him. Irene continued. She presented the 6 prior purchases made by Meridian Valley Properties. She presented the independent appraisal placing my mother's property at $251,000. She noted the gap between that figure and the $187,000 offer, $64,000. And she noted that a licensed agent with a financial interest in the purchasing entity had not disclosed that interest to the seller or the seller's family at any point in the transaction. She did not use the word fraud. She didn't need to. She then presented my mother's letter. She quoted 2 sentences, the sentences we had chosen the night before, the ones that needed no additional weight. My mother had written clearly and without self-pity, and what she had written was enough. Judith Quine read the letter herself without rushing. When she set it down, she folded her hands. "Mr. Greer," she said, "you've been largely quiet this morning." "I've been listening," I said. "You documented all of this before this mediation was convened?" "The documentation preceded the mediation by approximately 3 weeks," I said. "The mediation provided the appropriate venue to present it." She nodded once. Then she voided the offer from Meridian Valley Properties, effective immediately. She noted the disclosure failure and indicated she was referring the matter to the Ohio Division of Real Estate and Professional Licensing for review of the agent's conduct. She also stated that the estate distribution would proceed independently through the estate attorney without further involvement from any party with a personal financial interest in the outcome. My wife stood when Judith finished. She didn't say anything. She looked at me across the table, and for a moment her face had a quality I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger exactly, but something behind it. Something that might have been recognition. My brother-in-law had not been in the room. He called my wife's cell phone 4 times during the hour after the mediation ended. She went to her sister's apartment that afternoon and didn't come back for 3 days. She sent me a message from there. "You blindsided us. You've been planning this for months." I read it once and set the phone on the counter. My son called 2 days later. He was 33 and lived in Pittsburgh and had spent the weeks between my mother's death and the mediation mostly silent, which was his way of declining to take sides. He asked me to tell him what had happened. I told him. He listened without interrupting. "Mom said you were too emotional to handle the estate," he said when I finished. "I know," I said. "Were you?" I thought about the letter in the fireproof box. I thought about sitting in my mother's driveway the night before the mediation, watching the porch light. I thought about 31 years of looking at transactions designed to be invisible. "No," I said. I was attentive. "Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet. "Then she really had him listed in the LLC?" "Page 3, I said. Another silence. I didn't know what to think when this started. "I want you to know that." "You don't owe me an accounting of your doubts," I told him. "I'm glad you called." We talked for another 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the estate. It wasn't a resolution. It was the beginning of one, which is a different thing and takes longer. My daughter called 4 days after that. She lived in Denver and worked in healthcare administration, and had always been the one who processed information before emotion, which made her easier to talk to than she probably realized. "I saw the LLC filing," she said. "Irene sent a copy to the estate attorney and I asked to see it." "I know," I said. Uncle, her brother, he called me before all of this. He told me you were struggling. He said Mom was worried about you making decisions you'd regret. She stopped. I didn't push back. I should have. You didn't have enough information to push back, I said. I had enough instinct, she said. That's not the same thing. She was right. I didn't tell her she was wrong. What happens to the house now? She asked. It goes on the market properly. Independent listing agent. Fair price. Good, she paused. I called Aunt your sister, she cried when I told her. She called me too, I said. Is this going to be okay? She wasn't asking about the estate specifically. I understood that. Some of it will, I said. The rest takes time. She accepted that. When she hung up, I sat in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window at the low May angle that warms a room without washing it out, and I stayed there for a while without doing anything in particular. The licensing board opened a formal inquiry into my brother-in-law's conduct 31 days after the mediation. He retained an attorney. Irene told me, in that level tone she uses when she is relaying information without editorializing, that the inquiry was proceeding in a direction that made his continued licensure unlikely in the near term. Meridian Valley Properties voluntarily dissolved its LLC registration shortly after the mediation. She described that as a response she had seen before in situations of this kind. The estate moved forward. A proper listing agent sold the house in 6 weeks for $243,000 to a couple with 2 young children who planned to repaint the kitchen and put a garden in the backyard. I thought my mother would have found that satisfactory. She was not a sentimental woman, but she paid attention to what things were used for, and she thought houses were for living in. My son came to see me in July. He didn't call ahead. I have come to understand that in him as a form of apology that costs him something, which is the kind that means more. He showed up on the porch on a Sunday morning with a bag from a bakery 2 towns over, and a look on his face that I recognized as the expression of a man who has been doing his own accounting and arrived at a number he wasn't prepared for. We sat at the kitchen table. At one point he said, "I think I've been taking someone else's word for who you are for a long time." I told him I understood that. I told him I hadn't given him many alternative sources. He nodded slowly. "You're not an easy person to know." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." He stayed through dinner. Before he left, he hugged me briefly in the doorway, the quick, firm way men his age do, as though warmth requires a time limit to be acceptable. I didn't say anything. Some things communicate more clearly without words. That lesson has taken me most of my adult life to apply correctly, and I am still not always sure I get it right. My mother's letter is in a drawer in my desk now, not in the fireproof box, in the desk where I can take it out without ceremony. I have read it more times than I've counted, not because I need reminding of what it says, but because her handwriting is still her handwriting, and for a few minutes when I'm holding it, the distance between her death and this moment feels smaller. She wrote that being careful is not the same as being slow. She was right. She was right about most things, and she had the particular wisdom of a person who spent her life watching closely and saying only what mattered. I did not inherit her economy of words, but I inherited her habit of attention, and that has turned out to be the more useful thing. My mother used to say that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who has already finished thinking while everyone else is still beginning. She said it once, when I was maybe 14, at the dinner table, and I remember looking up and understanding that she was explaining me to myself, plainly, without fuss, with the confidence of someone who had been watching me since before I knew I was worth watching. I kept watching. I kept paying attention. I just didn't announce it. If you've ever been the person in the room that someone else decided they already understood, tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what time it is there. These are the stories that deserve to be told, and I have more of them.